Hi, Aggie. I'm so sorry that you couldn't be with us at that Human Rights in Childbirth conference in Den Haag in June because you were under house arrest. At least you weren't in jail. But before I give my perspective on that, I want to tell you where I am, Aggie. I'm here in the most serene place. I'm here in a place on the Madawaska, the river, which is 1 hour from Ottawa. Ottawa is Canada's nation's capital. I worked there and I sat on the Women, Peace and Security Committee that helped our country not go to Iraq. But this is where I come, Aggie, because this is the place of the Algonquin First Nations people. This is where they still to this day hunt white-tailed deer. And this is the place where I and they can be in harmony with nature. This is the place, and it's from First Nations people really, and the Inuit, that midwives have learned about the importance of rites of passage of women, where we have learned a lot in the last few years about the importance of ritual and the importance of taking back birth. You know, the natives, the First Nations people went to war, the Second World War, along with the settlers here against the Nazis. And so the natives understand as well as we did what the Iron Curtain is. The Iron Curtain was, at the time that it was set up by the USSR, as a block, a barrier between the East and the West. It was an ideological, a political barrier. It wasn't until 1989 that Hungary came out of that. It wasn't until 2002 that I could actually even come and see you. But Aggie, I remember the day that I arrived with a contingent of North American midwives. It was so exciting. It was with the Midwifery Today folk, and I remember coming in and meeting you. You were cross-legged on the floor with the other 40 community women, midwives, and women with their children hanging around with diapers. It reminded me, even though at that time you were it seemed to be starting your home birth movement and reclaiming undisturbed birth, it reminded me of the 1970s when we threw out our TVs, moved out to the country, ate a lot of peaches and granola, and took back birth. By the 1980s, we made a decision that we needed to mobilize more people. We formed the Midwives Alliance of North America, we formed the Canadian Confederation of Midwives, and we also started working more and more with the Indigenous people. I had learned from traditional midwives in Guatemala, and the Inuit Women's Association asked me to come up and talk to the elders about it. So that by the 1990s, the Canadian governments, right across all the different provinces, started realizing that they needed to legislate midwives, and they needed to condone and legislate and institutionalize the requirement that midwives had to do home births as well as hospital births. It was a great time. The millennium is even a better time, because you know why? Now is the time when science is proving that those stormy times need to keep coming, because the science is finally proving that what we thought in the 1970s intuitively is real. We now know that home birth is safe. We know that from the Dutch studies, the Canadian studies, the British Medical Journal article that Ken produced on, and I produced on for the midwives in the States. We know that it's now safe. To the extent that in 2004, FIGO, the International Federation of Gynecology and Obstetrics, made a decision to hire a midwife. That midwife was me, and I have to say, even though I knew what they were hiring before, it was to run their Safe Motherhood program to cut down on maternal mortality internationally. But I said, why did you really hire a midwife? And they said, well, Betty Ann, you are the first midwife we have ever hired. They said that we are no longer relevant to women. In fact, women consider us an old boys club. And I went, oh, well, it's good you finally figured that out. But we had a great time. We ended up doing lots of projects, mostly in low-resource countries, where the physicians at OB, the obstetric societies, had to get together with the women, with the midwives organizations, but also the women's groups on the ground. And Jirke Lijestrand actually said to me at one point, but Ann, just be easy on them, right? These are OBs. They don't usually work with women's groups on the ground, so give them some time. And so, along with them, the societies of obstetricians in the UK and in Canada made a decision to put out positive statements towards home birth. Did ACOG do that? No. Did your Hungarian physicians do that? No. But your Hungarian physicians, Aggie, your physicians use the most ridiculous arguments about home birth and why it shouldn't be happening, and why they should have jurisdiction over home birth. The first argument they used was, they said, well, in the 13th century, the obstetricians learned how to dismember babies in order to save the mothers. What a ridiculous thing to use as a reason why they should be involved in childbirth. They don't do that anymore. But sometimes, you know, physicians often will invent things to do, and then they start to use it more than they really need it. And that includes everything from forceps to cesareans, right? The second argument they used was, well, we are connected with Ignatius Semmelweis. And Ignatius Semmelweis was the Hungarian, very famous obstetrician who exposed the fact that if you go from doing an autopsy on a cadaver to then doing a vag exam on a woman, you could introduce terrible infection. And that's in fact what happened. They were killing about 30% of the women at that time. It was a terrible, terrible time. But you know, the Hungarians, obstetricians trying to connect themselves with Semmelweis was not really a smart thing to do, because if you realize in the end that they ended up putting him in an asylum. The third argument that they used was, well, we know that the feminists don't agree with home birth. That's so untrue. That's so untrue. I think what they were doing, I thought, what are they reading? I realized they must have been reading the 1920 suffragettes literature, because the suffragettes were really trying to access hospital birth for women. Because today the feminists are all about choice, so you can't use that argument. You can't use the feminist card. And the final argument that they used was statistics. But they didn't use statistics looking at the safety of home birth. They looked at statistics in terms of how many home births are going on in the United States. They said fewer than 1% of home births fewer than 1% of the births happening in the US are home births. And therefore we don't want to do that because we'll look like a third world nation. So these were all very odd arguments to use. We are no longer thinking in terms of human rights only in terms of women or people being tortured in jails. Because now the academics are starting to define human violations in terms of body politics. And what that means is, if your body is raped, if your body is tortured, if your body is thrown in jail, if you are put under house arrest as you are injudiciously, that is human violation. But also in 2009, the UN actually passed a resolution to say that maternal mortality and morbidity is also something that should be classified as a human violation, human rights violation. And what that means, Aggie, is that it's not just if women die, but if women are harmed and injured during childbirth, that is a violation. And you know, and I know, that if every third woman in a country is having a cesarean section, and some places more, that is a violation. We are so excited about the fact that Tony and Alex are making this film that you're going to see. And we are so excited about the fact that you have done what you've done. You've martyred yourself, but it's incredibly important for us all. And we're really happy that Anna won that court case against the Hungarian government for not providing her with safe home birth. Because you know what you're all doing? What you are doing is you're exposing the fallacious arguments of the obstetricians. In fact, you are all unveiling an ironic curtain.